Good morning and welcome to the Pandemic Lecture Series. This is Roy Mendoza. I'm from the Department of History and I was tasked to do a lecture on EDSA because of the lockdown. Uh, I'd like to tell you more about this topic both as a historian and as a participant to this event. Yes, I was there and I can tell you more. I can tell you this from a first-hand account. Secondly, please bear with me. Welcome to online learning. It takes quite some time to get adjusted to this so-called new normal. But hopefully, the topic will be very interesting to for us to forego of these many challenges and hurdles. Okay, so let's get down to business. Uh, if you notice, all these are related to roads. Okay, so it's divided into three parts. The first is the road to EDSA. So I'd like to discuss events, political events, no, leading to what we may call the EDSA revolt, which is from February 22 to 25 of 1986. I'd like to tell you more also about the major players as well as the sequence. Okay, and the second is the road to the world. This topic is not often discussed, but I'd like to tell you more about EDSA as a template for regime change, especially in authoritarian and totalitarian regimes in the late 80s and early 90s. Finally, the road to justice. So I'd like to tell you more about efforts to put to account Marcos and his cronies. Of course, there were many challenges, but also there were gains in trying to put them to account. And also, I'd like to tell you more about reparations, what have been done in order to correct this wrongdoing. The first chapter is the road to EDSA. In order to understand this event, I'd like to use two graphs and a timeline. Please bear with me. This is a little bit tedious, but very necessary for us to understand this event. Okay, so the first slide, I'd like to demonstrate to you that the Marcos regime or the martial law regime rests on many pillars. There were plenty of support at its advent in 1972. Among them, let's start from the left, the churches. Not only the Catholic Church, many bishops initially supported martial law, but also Protestant churches. Going to the right, we see in the international community, yes, many nations recognized Marcos and the legality of martial law in 1972. After all, martial law is not an event that is local or particular to the Philippines. In many other parts of the world, there were many instances of governments undertaking authoritarian regime or martial law. At the center, we find the military, the greatest support or the most loyal part of the sectors critical to Marcos. But of course, Marcos also tried to politicize the military in order to gain its loyalty. We, for example, remember that the biggest chunk of the budget went to the armed forces, more than education, more than basic services, appointments of its key officials in in cabinet, and also trying to woo them in so many ways. And then going to the right, we see business. The business community, yes, supported the Marcos regime. Uh, Number one, because of predictability, no, you understand or you can forecast what will happen in the next few years. Also, it created a favorable climate for investments. You have tax breaks, exclusive economic zones. You have, for example, peace and security that was very much needed in order for business to grow. And lastly, you have the middle class. Yes, many welcome the martial law. In contrast to the, shall we say, chaos of the pre-martial law regime. When it comes to peace and order, you have very less criminality that was reported, but also many middle class supported martial law because in the first 5 years, uh, Mar- the Marcos regime registered very good or very impressive economic growth, so that many middle class would think that Marcos was very good, martial law was good, and therefore let us forget about Ninoy, let us forget about human rights. You know? After all, I mean, we sacrifice a little in order to gain a lot. Before we begin with this second slide, I'd like to remind you to please remember the first slide. As we go along the timeline, I'd like to demonstrate how these pillars of support eroded, so that by February of 1986, there was only one pillar left supporting Marcos, and that was the military. So this is the political spectrum. Um, it was meant to map out many of the major players. Political spectrum was very popular during the martial law era in order for them to understand which forces would be, shall we say, dominant, what were their strategies, how would they coalesce with other groups. This exercise is no longer popular uh, these days. In lieu, we have many other like popularity surveys, SWS surveys, etc. Okay. To begin, let's look at the topmost terms. We have the left, the center, and the right. They may look simple, but these terms are definitely very much loaded. Let's go first to history. How did the terms left, right, and center emerge? One explanation is that it came about during the French Revolution. As you know, the monarchy was overthrown in 1789, and after that, there was a conference in order to map out the future of France. It so happened that those who were seated on the right advocated for political change, meaning they wanted to do away with the monarchy, abolish the monarchy. Those who were seated on the left were not satisfied with just political change. They also wanted to overthrow, or shall we say, do away with the economic system of feudalism. Okay, so there were only feudal lords and serfs at that time, but they wanted to change this into something else. Guilds eventually developed into what is now called capitalism. Uh, Another distinction is strategy. It is often said, or the left is often equated with radical action. Uh, yes, the right is, shall we say, contented with, legal means. Well, not necessarily so. Uh, Although in the context of martial law, suffice it to say, let's just put it this way, the right was interested in changing Marcos through the ballot. The left, on the other hand, did not believe in the ballot, they believed in the bullet. Another distinction is worldview. The left are often called progressives because they believed in the natural progression of humankind. By this, we mean, for example, advocacies. Leftist advocacies would often center on civil liberties, human rights, gender rights, environmental protection, okay, uh, pro-choice, many things that, shall we say, not very different from what has been established by the status quo. Right, on the other hand, would mean to go back to a previous setup, uh, to go back to the status quo. Uh, it is very At this point, it is necessary to say that the right can also be militant, it can be radical, and it could also be, shall we say, employ terror. We see, for example, Al Qaeda. We see, for example, ISIS. And in the United States, there are many paramilitary groups who don't believe in the Confederates, for example. Those who still believe in slavery, or those who believe that slavery was, so much a part of this. Okay, so again, both, no, both the left and the right can use violence or coercion if necessary according to the time period. Now, let's focus our attention on the pink straight line. If you notice, there are groups that are above it and there are groups below it. Okay? So, for example, the National Democrats, uh, above ground, okay, you have groups such as Bayan, uh, KMU, LFS, for example, but also they have underground groups. By underground, we mean those that are not uh, legal as prescribed by the government. They are underground organizations, meaning they operate outside of the purview of the law as defined by a government. Okay, so if you see groups that are below the pink line, they are underground groups. Okay, uh, groups that are above are so-called legal, uh, or operates within the purview of the law. Okay, so let's start from the left. Uh, the first group is what you call the PKP, or the Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas. The PKP was founded on November 7, 1932, and during the wartime, it evolved. The PKP had its arm, the Hook Rebellion, or the Hooks. They launched a rebellion. Afterwards, the Hooks became the Hukbong Magpapalaya ng Bayan. But by the early 50s, the rebellion had been crushed. Uh, and by 1970, and many of its leaders were captured, so that by 1974, the PKP signed an agreement with Marcos. They became above ground. They forego of armed struggle. Okay. Next to that is the CPP, the NPA, and NDF. Former members of the PKP came up with a new party called the Communist Party. If the PKP was oriented towards Moscow, the new one, the CPP, was oriented towards China, towards Beijing. What were some of the differences? Uh, the PKP was rural-based. Many of its leaders were peasants. The CPP, many of its leaders were urbanites, mostly college graduates from the University of the Philippines. One of the shortcomings of the PKP was that it was centered only on peasants and workers. They failed to harness other sectors, especially the students, professionals, religious. And this is the rationale for the National Democratic Front. It wants to bring together all those who opposed Marcos based on its 10-point program. Uh, later, in March 28th of 1969, the CPP was founded on December 26th of 1969. Mao's birth anniversary, and then the following year, March 28, they came up with the NPA. The NDF would be launched only in 1977. Now, above that, you have what you call the National Democrats. So, National Democrats, you are called not them if you believe in their 10-point program. The transition from Marcos towards, well, another dispensation. The NDF is composed of many sectors. So just like as I mentioned earlier, you have workers, so you have KMU, peasants, you have KMP, students, you have LFS, uh, and then you have a women's group, Gabriela, etc. So, present day configuration or present day metamorphoses, these are within what you call the Makabayan bloc in Congress. So many of these groups gravitated, came up with party list groups, and eventually landed a few seats in Congress. Next to it are what we call the independent socialists. So these were the group of Dodong Nemenso, Randy David, those who were subscribed to Marxist thinking but not organizationally affiliated with any of these major political groups. At present day, independent socialists gravitated along with SOCDEMs and NATDEMs into what is now Akbayan. The next is what we call the Social Democrats. Uh, Social Democrats refer to those who refer to its 14-point program. They are, shall we say, in contrast to the National Democrats who were part of the so-called Third International. The Social Democrats fall into the Socialist International. So they believe that socialism and democracy comes hand in hand. Uh, there are underground groups. Among these would be Kasapi, and later on it evolved into the Light a Fire movement. Uh, Later on, it had its wing called the April 6 Liberation Movement. And then also we have the PDSP. Going to the right, we have, of course, the MNLF. The MNLF was the most dominant opposition force to Marcos until 1976, before the signing of the Tripoli Agreement. Moving to the right, we have PDP Laban, which was established in Cagayan de Oro in 1983. Its roots resemble those of the Social Democrats, although it was organizationally different. The Liberal Party, from time to time, it would appear, but many of its uh, leaders went into exile. Ninoy was incarcerated until 1980. Okay. And then we have the center, and then we have the traditional politicians. So this would include Vice President Laurel, Mobono Adasa, and the many pre-war political elites not belonging to Marcos. The biggest party at the time was the KBL, or the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, the one-party state of martial law. Okay. And to the right, we have RAM, the Reform the Armed Forces movement. Yes, it was a shall we say an underground group, but later on it emerged after the peace deal with the government in 1992. Okay, let's now proceed to the timeline. In 1972, martial law is declared. There were mass arrests. Okay, so many of the so-called oppositionists at that time landed in jail. So all political parties, groups, or formations were banned. Opposition came mostly from the MNLF. Even before martial law was declared, there was already brewing tension in Mindanao. But by 1972, it escalated into a full-blown rebellion. The CPP was, because of its very clear understanding, analysis of the situation, it was able to conclude that it was able to foresee that martial law was coming, and therefore they were able to provide sanctuaries. They already started preparing for the underground network, so that many of these student activists became cadres and went to the countrysides, and many of them escaped arrests. Now, many of the student activists at that time, those who were not part of the CPP, eventually became part of the CPP network because, one, they had the organizational capacity to do that, but also they provided a very strong ideological frame. Among these would be Edgar Hobson. So let's remember that from 1972 to until 1976, Although opposition came mostly from the DAP-Dems and the MNLF, it was the MNLF that was carrying on the much of the opposition towards Marcos. By 1976, we already have the Tripoli Agreement signed between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the MNLF. So there was a cessation of hostilities. The CPP became the primary oppositionist to the Marcos regime. They were shall we say, at the forefront of the struggle. Okay, and also the following year, the CPP launches the National Democratic Front in order to attempt to unite various sectors in its 10-point minimum program. Now, it is very important to say or to emphasize. In 1977, an unknown from the southern state of Georgia became president, and he is none other than James Earl Carter. Carter was a Protestant. He was a naval aviator who served in the Philippine theater. Yeah, he was here as a naval aviator in the Philippines. But more than that, he was an outsider. His administration, because at the time, during the time of Nixon and later on Reagan, we have this what you call the Carter interregnum. It was, shall we say, a bright spot in American foreign policy during the Cold War, whereas Nixon and Carter and Reagan would be known for realpolitik or playing hardball against enemies. We saw the, shall we say, the extension of the Cold War into proxy wars, so that during their time, they propped up many dictators like Marcos and many other parts of the world in order to preserve American interests against communism and socialism. Carter was different. He tried to introduce the idea of human rights, meaning these countries, our allies, should have a modicum of human rights standards. They should respect human rights if they want to trade or if they want to deal with the United States. So that was a sore point in the relations between the Philippines and the United States. The Carter presidency would also be known for, in the Philippines, no, release of political prisoners, prominent political prisoners. This would include Trining Herrera, Alex Bongcaya, but the most famous of them all was Benigno Aquino. It was through U.S. efforts, U.S. lobbying that Ninoy Aquino was able to escape 7 years of detention and go to the U.S. for medical reasons. At present, we have one building that would, shall we say, commemorate, or shall we say, would remember as a symbol of this U.S. prodding to introduce the legislature, and that was, and this is the Batasang Pambansa. In 1978, we had, in April of that year, we had an election to finally introduce a legislature. Prior to that, Marcos was both the executive and the legislator. He came up with presidential decrees, letters of instruction, executive orders, etc. And he was the one to implement it. By 1978, there was already this what we call interim batasang pambansa, or a legislature. Okay, but let me just tell you that we followed initially the parliamentary model. This made it easier for leaders like Marcos to extend its term. Unlike in the presidential system where you have fixed terms, in a parliamentary system it could be override. Okay. So in 1977, in 1978, we saw the, shall we say, an opportunity for oppositionists to come together and challenge Marcos through the ballot. Okay. On April 7 of 1978, an election was held in order to determine who the constituents or the members of the IBP, the interim batasan pambansa to an election. As I said in the earlier slide, there were this provided an opportunity for oppositionists to come together and run for election. So the party of the government was KBL. Now, the oppositionists had an earlier difficulty. The Liberal Party didn't want to take part in it. and so did many other politicians. It was through the efforts of Ninoy Aquino, who was jailed at the time, who said, "Come on, let's fight Marcos." What happened was Aquino, along with some politicians, came up with Laban, or the Laban ng Bayan. Uh, Laban, of course, it's the letter L, but Laban was also an aggregation of different forces. For the first time, one of the CPP components, the Manila Rizal Party, opted to participate. This was a, shall we say, a big no-no, and many of its leaders said it was an adventure. But many were saying that we should capitalize on the people's resentment, people's anger against martial law, so that the CPP, or the MRP, the Manila Rizal, which was then headed by Ed Job, and also uh, Popoy Lagman, came up with some leaders, shall we say, some members, in order to form the coalition. So among them would be Trining Herrera, as a leader of the Urban Poor Group Zoto, Zone 1 Tondo organization. We, of course, remember also Alex Bongcayaw, who was a labor leader, and later on, the hit squad of the CPP was named after him, the Alex Bongcayaw Brigade. And also we have Jerry Barican, a student leader, who became the executive secretary of ERAP. Now, this is important for many reasons. Number one, it was a, shall we say, a baptism of fire, especially for Ateneo students. Many Ateneo students participated in this as volunteers. They believed that, because you can or give leaflets, and in the leaflets you can tell the people the ills of martial law. So they came up with a lot of issues. It's not important to win for them, but what is important is to expose the evils caused by martial law. Now, on the eve of the elections, April 7, on April 6, on the night of April 6, the oppositionists called for a noise barrage. Meaning, the Aquilino Pimentel, Nene Pimentel said, "We may be cheated tomorrow, but let us register our support for Laban by way of a noise barrage. So come on the evening, no, 7 o'clock. Come outside, bring your pots, pans, and let's do a lot of noise." Now the church also, the Catholic Church also supported this. Some of the parishes began ringing their bells, no? And much to the surprise of many of the oppositionists, it generated a whirlwind of support, meaning the noise barrage extended up until curfew, up until around 12 midnight. And one of the centers of protest was Katipunan Avenue. If you passed by Katipunan Avenue at the time, it was like a New Year's Eve revelry. Some tires were burned, plenty of firecrackers. Yeah, it was very festive, but also it manifested support for the opposition. Now, let me tell you this. In the latest book compiled by Rapalopa, then President Cory Aquino, in his memoir, said that Marcos became scared of this noise barrage, so that he ordered the COMELEC to blank the slate of Laban, meaning all the Laban candidates lost 21-0. Not even Ninoy Aquino won the election. He lost the election to the shall we say, to the even to the most unknown member of the KBL. This was not the result in other places. For example, in Cebu, the opposition led by Hilario Davide scored some victories, and also in Cagayan de Oro and Zamboanga. But in Metro Manila, it was not. Now, what was the result of this? Now, again, there was this joke, no? In the Philippines, because you have a COMELEC who is very well capable, even if you win the balloting, you will lose in the counting. And that is what happened. Okay, April 7, election time, the following day, it was already announced. No, the results were announced already. That very short, no, in less than 24 hours, you already have the results. Okay, so What the oppositionists did was to come up with an indignation rally, meaning they wanted to protest the results of the election. It happened on April 9. Now, the idea was to mass up around the Welcome Rotunda and march towards the Comelec building somewhere in the Intramuros area. And in these pictures, I'd like to show you one. On the upper left, you see the logo or the poster of the Lakas ng Bayan. Upper right, you see a cardboard coffin, so it signifies the death of democracy. Uh, and then, if you look at the person, the man with the eyeglasses, sunglasses, I mean, that's Nene Pimentel. Okay. And then upper left, lower right, you see Lorenzo Tañada along with his wife, and then on the right side, that's Senator Soc Rodrigo. On our left, that's inside the van, that's Joker Arroyo. Yes, they were arrested for being the ringleaders of this event, of this demonstration. On the lower left, you see scores of students. Yeah, many of them Ateneans. They were herded into Metro Manila buses and were brought to Camp Bagong Diwa in Taguig. They spent close to a week, I think, uh, and then they were eventually pardoned, but not for the leaders. The leaders stayed for several months until their release. Now, what is the importance of this event? Number one, it showed to the world, I showed to them that the ballot is no longer feasible. It's high time we move up the ante. It's high time we move on to the next stage, and this is called armed struggle. So many of these groups eventually entertained the idea of armed struggle. So we remember, for example, light a fire. So light a fire was meant in order to torch, to burn many of the symbols of martial law. So this included a floating casino. Yeah, we had a floating casino at the time. We had, Intramuros got burned, the office of the Daily Express, the Marcos, shall we say, newspaper. And then later on, we have the April 6 Liberation Movement in order to uh, remember or to commemorate that spontaneous swell of oppositionists. The A6LM was involved in bombings, not really to hurt, but to force Marcos to resign. And one of the spectacular events at the time was while Marcos was speaking to a group of the American Society of Travel Agents, a bomb exploded, and it was really shall we say, a big, very big embarrassment on the part of Marcos. Okay, secure. I mean, he was trying to tell that everything is okay. Then, while in the middle of a speech, a bomb exploded. Okay. Okay. From 1978 onwards, not many things. There were a few major events. Number one is the formal lifting of martial law, or the lifting of martial law on paper, but de facto it was not the same. The following month, this was in January of 1981, this was in preparation for next month's big event. And what is that? That is the first papal visit of John Paul II. Perhaps because of this event, perhaps because of pressures from Malacanang, Marcos did try to make some adjustments in order to look good to the outside world. Of course, the economy was in bad shape. It continued its deterioration. Infighting inside the palace was becoming more, shall we say, virulent. But the biggest event that rocked us was the assassination of Nina Aquino on August 21 of 1983. August 21 has a double meaning, double symbolic meaning. The first one is August 21, 1971, the Plaza Miranda bombing. Two grenades were lobbed while the senatorial slate of the Liberal Party was speaking during the meeting de Avance. 10 people got killed, and all the senatorial candidates of the Liberal Party were severely wounded. Among them was Jovito Salonga. Uh, Ninoy left the country in 1980 for a heart surgery. He stayed in the US for the next 3 years. In the meantime, he was planning to unite the opposition against Marcos. And when the government you know, got wind of this, there was a meeting between Imelda and Ninoy at the Waldorf Astoria, and Senator Macedo was there, and also Steve Sinakis, from the he married a Lopez king. Imelda tried to persuade Ninoy not to come back. But of course, Ninoy Aquino had a mind of his own, so he came to the country at a very symbolic date, August 21 of 1983. And we all know that it was a cover-up. It was an assassination attempt. Now, the picture that you see here is the picture of Ninoy when he was right immediately after he was assassinated. Her mother, si Doña Aurora, uh, uh, Doña, her mother did not want to clean up the body for the people to see the injustice that had been committed against his son. So you see here a picture of Ninoy, his shirt, the same shirt that he wore going down the plane. It's no longer white, it's full of red because of blood, and you see in his chin that is where the bullet hole exited from the back of the head. And you can see a terrified Cardinal Sin viewing the body. Now, we went there. Initially, our reaction was, well, he's just one of the many political prisoners or the many victims of political or the extrajudicial killings at the time. What would make him so special? But little did we know that we did not found out until much later on that there were, shall we say, a social volcano ready to erupt at the time. And proof of this was when we went to Quezon, to Santo Domingo Church in Quezon Boulevard. Uh, we even in the mo even at the even at morning time, you can see thousands queuing just to see the body of Ninoy. The line extended all the way to Banawe. At the time, it was the biggest. It was, shall we say, the longest queue for a funeral that I have seen in my life. So this is the picture of Ninoy Aquino's funeral. I attended this event along with my friends. It started at around 9 o'clock. There was a mass prior to this at Santo Domingo. Although it was full of people, yeah, we did not expect, I did not certainly expect to see millions, no, along the way. Uh, from Santo Domingo Church, the plan was to move towards España, then on to Luneta. It made a stop, and then from there proceed towards uh, Quirino Avenue, and from there go towards South Luzon Expressway leading to the Manila Memorial Park in Parañaque. Uh, it last The funeral march started from around 9:30 or 10. It lasted until about 12 hours later. That was how long it was. That was how, in the while we were in Luneta, suddenly it poured. Uh, we expected people to shy away. No, 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 they did not. They continued, no? In spite of being wet. We continued walking all the way to Parañaque. And what I can tell you is that this is the most number of people I've seen, eclipsing many of the events that I've probably the most number of people na mas marami lang would be the people visit. Number two, you can feel people's they were sad, yeah, but deep inside they were angry. uh, as you move to the streets, parang people were saying, sayang, why do they have to do this? They could have just jailed Dina, but why kill this person? Okay. So that was an event that was memorable to our generation. When Cory was put to rest, yes, there were a lot of people, but not that many. People were happy. People were sad, yes, but also they were thankful. No? In the case of Ninoy, people were sad, but people were angry. Probably, if there were provocateurs at the time who said, let's go to Malacanang, I'm sure many people would go there in order to demonstrate. This is the famous poster of the coalition made right after Ninoy Aquino's death. It's called Jaja, Justice for Aquino, Justice for All. Uh, there were many other well-known extrajudicial killings at the time, including Macri and Dulag, but Ninoy was different. Because of Ninoy Aquino, there were a lot of protests. There was an eruption of protests, so to speak, after him. Perhaps we can compare. Perhaps it's not entirely wrong to say that what is happening in the U.S., George Floyd, there were many blacks who were, shall we say, killed, murdered before that, but with the killing of George Floyd, it suddenly erupted into massive protests that we see in the United States. Okay, so some of the pictures of protests at the time, yeah, there were many. No, the one on the right, you can see. This is a. I attended this rally in front of Welcome Rotonda, so you can see the one in the middle, holding his eyes. That's Chino Roses, and then you see Ed Garcia, the one with the beret cap, and then the one with gas mask. That's Lorenzo Tañada and his son, Wigberto Tañada. We got tear gas many times during that era. Now, if on the one hand you have protests like this, if you rally in the symbolic areas like Liwasang Bonifacio, etc., you get tear gas, you get truncheoned, you get beaten by the police. Now, a safer way of doing this was the one on the left. In Makati, Makati became a, shall we say, also a center of protests. Uh, you will not get clobbered, you will not get truncheoned or tear gas because this is private property. This was, as you know, this is owned by the Ayalas. And at the time, it's a different kind of protest because number one, the composition. If you join the rallies, the one on your right, mostly you will see peasants. But this one on the left, you join the rallies in Makati, you see professionals, people in barong, people in with their ties, sometimes with their suit joining. It was yellow because yellow was the when Ninoy arrived, the song was "Tie a Yellow Ribbon." So many employees, when they see these demonstrations, what they would do is tear up the pages of the yellow pages, or what you call the directory. We don't have it anymore because everything is digitized. So yeah, it was a very festive mood. Okay. One important ramification of the 1983 assassination of Ninoy was that it produced cracks within the military. Okay, it was not known then at the time, but the military had many gripes against Marcos, especially the professional ones, those who came from the Philippine Military Academy. Many of them could not be promoted because of the what you call the extendee generals. Generals who were loyal to Marcos were simply appointed again even beyond their retirement age because of their loyalty. Now, many of these professional soldiers could not be promoted to the next higher rank because of this. But also the issue of corruption. Many of them, went to the fields with their commanders pocketing the budget, and many of them had to fleece many of the rural folks in order to feed themselves, survive, but also because of abuses. As a result, the military became less and less popular, and the New People's Army became more and more popular. Okay, uh, what happened was that those who were disgruntled, mostly junior officers from the Philippine Military Academy, led by Class 1971, formed a group, uh, the Reform the Armed Forces movement. Soon it gravitated towards other classes, among them Almonte from class of 1961. For many of these professional soldiers, okay, those who were trained before martial law, they could not, you know, they could not imagine, or they could not swallow, they could not accept the fact that why would Ninoy have, I mean, why is it necessary for Ninoy to be killed? Many of them were saying, Just jail the person and you can silence him through that." Okay, but killing him, especially in public, it really caused an uproar. Now, the RAM was, shall we say, had a rival, and that this is the UP Realadillo Battalion, or what you call the UP Vanguard. It is a brotherhood, supposedly like a fraternity. Its leader was, one of its members, one of its alumnus, was General Fabian Ver, who was the most loyal soldier to Marcos. He was the chief of staff for a very, very long time. The tale of two protagonists. On the left side, we see Marcos. Marcos was suffering terribly from uh, lupus, and oftentimes he was carried, not only carried, sometimes he was bleeding, and when he goes to his van, there's a machine ready to pump, to clean or to pump new blood to his kidney. So he was the picture of a dying tiger, and a dying tiger is it's in its most ferocious, shall we say, persona. On the other hand, you see a vibrant but accidental president. As we may say, no, it was no one could have predicted that Aquino would be the there was an initial attempt to draft her, but he said no. So what Chino Rosas did was to come up with 1 million signatures, and it was presented to her. Finally, many said, "Please, Cory, you are the symbol. You are the exact opposite of, and only you can defeat Marcos in an election." And to the credit of other oppositionists, through Cardinal Sin, for example, because Laurel was trying to come up with a third slate. What Sin did was, I mean, convince him to play vice president, to go under, to slide to vice president. So you have a united opposition. This is not what happened to South Korea. During the time of Chunduan, or democratization happened, there was an election. The two Kims, Kim Dae-jung and Kim Yong-sam, split. No? Rather than unify one ticket, they split the votes, and another dictator became the leader of South Korea. So pictures from the right after the election, the Marcos was proclaimed winner, and what Cory did was to come up with a boycott plan to boycott the products of cronies. It was the start of a civil disobedience, and there was a very, very big rally again in Malacanang in order to show support for Marcos. For The next is what may be called the EDSA uprising, EDSA revolt, or EDSA revolution. I chose two pictures to signify this. The first one is on the one on the left. This is one of the most viewed, shall we say, the most representative picture of that era. You see nuns praying along with supporters at the back in front of a marine detachment. This scene was uh, happened in what is now EDSA Galleria in Ortigas. The one on the right, the one on the left, I mean, is a picture of a contingent from the Ateneo. I use this picture, although it has some rebels on the left side. On the right side, you see Jesuit scholastics uh, uh, portrayed, shown in this picture. If you take a closer look, you'll find the seminarian holding the crucifix. He is none other than Father Tony Moreno, who was a Jesuit provincial and is now head of the Jesuit Conference on East Asia on the Pacific. On his back, you see a chinito-looking seminarian or scholastic. He is Father Bobby Yap. He is our incoming president. Okay, so for this slide, we look at some of the critiques leveled at EDSA. Uh, EDSA has more than enough share of criticisms coming mostly from two groups. The left, which I refer to the CPP, NPA, NDF, and of course the Marcos and their loyalists. They are, after all, the ones that lost heavily in EDSA. Let's look at the left first. Now, recall the second graph that I showed you, the political spectrum. So from 1977 until 1983, most of the opposition, most of those who, shall we say, or gravitated towards the not dems. Now, the important event or the important thing after 1983 is that radical politics, or shall we say, the political center slowly shifted away from the not dems, going into more towards the center. So when we say after 1983, although the NATDEMs were certainly a major player, perhaps the most numerous of them all, but the center of nationalism, the center of attraction, the center of the political center was now chiefly moving towards the SOCDEMs, the Liberal Democrats, so that at the end of EDSA, okay, the yellow forces consisted of the independent socialists up to the right of center, the traditional politician. What happened to the NATDEMs? For a very long time, they were at the vanguard of the struggle. It was the boycott stand. Okay, so the CPP decided to boycott the elections. In the meantime, there were some NDF personalities. In particular, I'd like to remember Boy Morales. He was saying, no, we should participate in the elections because that would further isolate the Marcos regime. Uh, the CPP miscalculated badly on this. And in fact, it will be one of the, shall we say, recurring errors, no? For the split in the party in the early 90s. But suffice it to say that at EDSA, the NATEMs are nowhere to be seen. Okay, so that's one important thing. Now, after that, of course, we can expect a lot of criticisms coming from them. So I outlined here three. No, so EDSA is not a revolution but an intra-elite conflict. That EDSA brought back the ills of a liberal democratic regime. Nothing much changed. Okay, so these are, shall we say, much can be expected from a perspective coming from the Marxist-Leninist sense. Now, the first point I'd like to make is EDSA is not a revolution in the Marxist-Lenin. It's not one class overthrowing the other. Okay, uh, in fact, it's not horizontal. It's more vertical, meaning various forces, various groups coming together into the anti-dictatorship drive. It's not, shall we say, horizontal. Okay, so for example, the CPP all encompassing all the other groups into this revolution. Okay, so it cannot be judged from a Marxist, Leninist perspective. The second point I'd like to make is related to this. This is the problem of transition. No one could have predicted, not anyone, that the outcome of EDSA would be like that. Many were saying at that time, if you were, at that time, it was very apparent that the revolution would, it will happen, and that most likely it will the communists who would rule the Philippines. But that is not so. Uh, it was a historical accident. Okay, so Cory Aquino, uh, uh, traditional politicians, leftists, democratic left oppositionists. Finally, the main ingredient came from the center of the military. Okay, so again, who could have predicted this? But it was made up of, shall we say, a varied group of interests, varied groups and varied interests. And again, this is the problem of transition. In many transitioning societies, the military was not part of this. But in our particular case, the military was so much a part of it. So how do you go after the military for its human rights abuses during? It was rather very difficult. There were attempts, yes, but it was very, very difficult. Again, the problem of transition. It's not a revolution, it was an anti-dictatorship struggle. We kicked out the dictator, yes, but it's not, shall we say, It was not designed to change the system. The third, just like what I said, yeah, so the left, in the words of Kathleen Weekly, they found themselves from the vanguard to the rear guard of radical politics. Interestingly, the Marcos, after being booted out of power, were also very vociferous in their critique of EDSA. After all, I mean, they could have been there for a much longer period of time, but the Filipino people decided otherwise. So some of the things that we can hear from them is that things were better off during martial law. In fact, some of them are saying that the golden years of the Philippine economy was during the martial law era. And that at the time, martial law, there was only one correct person, and that is Marcos. But then after that, there were so many predators. There were many corrupt people in government. Okay, and that victory was snatched from the realm. Well, first and foremost, the main point that I'd like to say is why blame Cory? Why blame the newly democratic regime for all the mess that they have made for the last 21 years? Cory had only 6 years, and in fact, many of the problems were very intractable. You cannot solve everything in 6 years. Okay, so I think many of these critique. Yeah, I mean, it's not a better process. But then again, let's try to remember, uh, if there were no coup attempts, if they did not finance these coup attempts, if the RAM did not launch coup attempts, things were better off. But because there was political instability because of the Marcos loyalists and the RAM, transition or took a longer time. Economic recovery took a longer time. So if there is anyone that we can blame for EDSA, it is them. Okay? So again, all of this did not happen, are only happening now. It's because they want to go back to Malacanang, return to Malacanang, enjoy the privileges of a presidential family. So they are now uh, this is very much well known. They have lots of trolls, lots of, shall we say, uh, people working for them to have historical revisionism. And at the moment, one thing good for them is that they're very close to Duterte. And in fact, during this time, during his presidency, did we see Marcos being laid to rest at the libingan ng mga bayani. Okay, so let's now look at some of the ramifications of this event and how this has impacted the world and in fact influenced many of the, shall we say, regime changes that occurred after. Okay, given that EDSA is not a revolution, not one class overthrowing the other, what is revolutionary about EDSA? Well, number one, it negated the prevailing belief at the time that only bloody revolutions could overthrow dictatorships and totalitarian regimes. Okay, so most of these revolutions happening worldwide were influenced by Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, socialist thought, all trying to come up with an armed struggle, armed revolution against the, but this has been, shall we say, some were successful, like in the case of Cuba, and but how about by the 1980s, when you have very, very strong military? And this is what EDSA is very particular about, or very unique about it. It was the first, at the time, it was the first successful bloodless revolution. Blood, there was one soldier killed, but again, it prevented a lot of bloodshed. It could have prevented a civil war. Now, if you look at the pictures, you see this Marine. He's a veteran of Mindanao and many other conflict. And suddenly you see people offering flowers, offering sandwiches. It gave them a moral ambivalence. How can I shoot these people when they are so friendly? They are giving me bread. And unlike, for example, if you go to a war zone, you can expect bullets. Okay, you will receive bullets, but here you receive sandwiches, you receive prayers, you receive the warm embrace of fellow Filipino, trying to, So, for example, if you were a soldier, you see, for example, how do I shoot the wife of my superior? Or if you're an officer, how do I shoot, for example, my neighbor, my classmate, my friend? So it gave a moral ambivalence in many of these. Okay, so it negated the coercive powers of the military. Yes, of course. Uh, you need to frighten Marcos a little bit for him to come to his senses. After all, he was groggy. But then again, you don't use it to kill. You don't use it to, kill other, you disable many of his capacities. That's all. That was the violence. Okay, perpetrated by also some parts of the rebel military. But beyond that, it really negated. There was no need to shoot each other out. The third wave of democratization happened with the fall of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and many parts of the world. So this was classified as the third wave. In particular, in Eastern Europe, where the former Soviet bloc countries, there was this famous saying. In Poland, it took 10 years, yes. Like Valenza and Solidarity, it took them 10 years from taking power. In Hungary, it was 10 months, okay? In East Germany, it was the fall of the wall in 10 days. The East German regime collapsed, and in Czechoslovakia, it was 10 days. How tempting it is to say that in EDSA, it only took 4 days. But of course, it was very, very complex. Now, suffice it to say that we gave the world, especially in Eastern Europe, a chance, okay, to look at, many were enamored because of people power. Okay, many were enamored because of this, and it became a template. And just to illustrate the popularity of EDSA, in 1989, during the bicentennial of the French Revolution, the guest of honor was none other than Cory Aquino, the woman in yellow, La Femme de Jaune. She even eclipsed Nelson Mandela to prove to you that we were very popular at the time. If you hold a Filipino passport, a Philippine passport, wow, no, people look up to you with a smile. Previously and after that, especially during this time, you have a Philippine passport, they sneer at you. It's as if you are TNT, etc. But there was a time, really, when Filipinos held their heads high because of this, our way of kicking out a dictator. And mind you, during the early years of reunification in Germany, no, in 1989, 1990, Filipinos were allowed to visit Germany without a visa. Yes, except that in the following years, many Filipinos abused the privilege and they had to reintroduce the visa requirement once again. However, not all people power revolts were successful. In particular, people power failed to generate its expected results in Asia. The first of these was in 1988 in Myanmar. As you can see on the picture on the left, Aung San Suu Kyi ran for office. Actually, they won with her party, the National League for Democracy, except that before the results could be given, announced officially, the military cracked down on it. So she was imprisoned for many, many, many years, while her supporters were also imprisoned. Many went into exile. And then also, let's not forget, even the Chinese were influenced by this event. It's in Tiananmen, 1989. A similar, no, people power, shall we say, expression of people power with the death of Hu Yaobang, who was, a very charismatic leader. But the response of the Chinese Communist Party, it was a slaughter. Hundreds of students were killed, undetermined number. But some would say it's in the hundreds, and many left to become exiles around the world. Of late, we can see the demonstrations in Hong Kong, and again, the Chinese Communist Party clamped down on it with the national security law. Let's now look at some of the efforts taken to bring Marcos and their cronies to justice. Why is it difficult for why is it difficult for us to make Marcos accountable during the early years of the transition? Well, there are some very obvious answers. But number one, Marcos fled the Philippines and escaped prosecution because he was friends with the Reagan. The Reagans, arranged an escape plan so that Marcos was beyond the reach of Philippine laws of Philippine sovereignty until his death in 1989. Also, if we pursue a case, it was not adequate to try Marcos. There were no statutes yet for human rights violations and plunder. They were very inadequate. And in fact, many of these would be introduced later. For example, plunder. there was no, the concept of plunder was non-existent in legal norms. It was because of the plunder done by the Marcos family that it was introduced in our law. So again, plunder before martial law, nothing, because nothing of that scale happened. It was own plunder law was in reaction to the predation of of Marcos and his cronies. Number three, especially among the middle class, especially among the elite, there was so-called this move-on mentality. Because the Philippines was, shall we say, became the sick man of Asia, became the dustbin. We were in the dustbin, no? We were, shall we say, the kulelat. So many of these were saying, rather than pursue Marcos, it will cause political instability. Why don't we just focus on reviving the economy? It's time to catch up with our neighbors. Okay. Also, there was this. You know, they kept on floating the terms reconciliation, forgiveness, etc. Which means let bygones be bygones. Just forget about it. Just move on. Well, what I can say is that uh, in one, it's hard. We cannot forgive those whom we cannot punish. Okay, so Hannah Arendt made that famous quote. And again, if you try to forget, it will recur. And that is what we are seeing now because we failed to prosecute them and they're here to come back. Okay. On the international scene, yun, because we were too early to democratize. Aside from us, it was only Argentina who democratized earlier. It was in 1983 in the as a result of the Falklands War with Great Britain. There was no template yet for putting to account wrongdoing. Later on, yes, you have hybrid courts that try, for example, genocide in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in the former Yugoslavia. There were also other examples of truth commissions like Africa and also memorialization. Okay, so it's only now that we are trying to do this, but for a very long time, none. Okay. I must tell you also that there are, shall we say, a modicum of success. There were successful efforts in trying to run after them. Number one is restitution. The first executive order of then President Cory Aquino was to form the Presidential Commission on Good Government to run after the illegal wealth or the stolen assets of Marcos and his cronies. Uh, until December of 2018, I don't know what happened after this, but we were able to recover something like 170 billion pesos. So this would include bank accounts, paintings, uh, watches, jewelries, which are still at the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, and many others. Okay, so it's not that bad. And in fact, many countries are appreciative of this. They say, wow, in the Philippines, you have a commission specially designed to do this. In some other countries, there are none. Also, there was this lawsuit against the Marcos estate in Hawaii. I can tell you more of that, but it's a very long discussion. So Marcos got convicted in 19. I mean, it's not a criminal case. It's a civil case. But for the first time, a dictator was found guilty of human rights violations. There are many firsts. Number one, it distinguished wrongdo, yung the what you call immunity from state action. For the first time, it was shattered. And also, we were able to, shall we say, lay jurisdiction on Marcos in spite of the fact that he was in Hawaii. And also, we were able to determine the amount of compensation. If you want to know more about this, please email me towards the end of I'll tell you my address. Also, I told you earlier that we had the introduction of the plunder law because no previous administration plundered or robbed the Philippines this much. If you want to know more about the success of the PSG, here is the link. They can tell you more what were the assets recovered, how much, when, who were the persons responsible for this, etc. Okay, I've been teaching this topic for quite some time, and what I can tell you is more and more as students become younger and younger, it is more and more difficult to teach martial law. Okay, for one, young people today have no reference point to these events, meaning you were born many years after the event. And therefore, unlike us, when we hear these truths or lies or historical revisionism, we can easily say it's true or it's not true because we have a reference point. Young people like you, most likely you hear martial law only from what that your teachers taught you or from your parents, mostly what you see on social media, which are actually not, many of them are not true. So, how do we how do we, shall we say, combat, or how do we do away with this? My last point is this. You can use history to solve the problem of memory. By history, I mean, look at the history books. Look at those works that have been written, historical works. These are not just works that were printed by scholars, but also they underwent a rigorous process. Most of the lies, most of the historical revisionists are not found in books. If they are very, very few, and if you look at how it was written, it did not, shall we say, pass through the rigorous process of scholarship. So easily you can see, or you can find that these are propaganda books. The second point is that history is also a discipline, okay, by which, uh, we can, because of the historical method, okay, by trying to read, analyze very carefully, try to link this with others, you try to reflect on it, or you try to digest it and try to understand it. It gives you the ability to discern, to analyze, and to postulate the many data in front of us. Okay? So again, use the records of history, use the writings of history, but also use history as a discipline in trying to understand and look beyond many of these false claims. The last slide is this. EDSA, for us, for our generation, it is the apex of our struggle against tyranny and oppression, against Marcos. So, yeah, we continue to improve society, but at the time it was, shall we say, the apex of our efforts to kick out a dictator. And no matter how many criticisms it is leveled against, we can say that, you did not participate in it, you lost heavily on it. While those who participated in EDSA were, shall we say, remember it until their last breath. That there was a moment wherein Filipinos came together, kicked out the dictator, and became proud in doing so. Now, we cannot replicate it as it is. Times are different, the actors are different. But this is what I can say. It is time for you, young generation, to take the road to EDSA. Make another EDSA. Okay? We are here to tell you, we are here to guide you, we are here to impart our lessons, but it is really you who will do the next change. It is you who will do the next EDSA. So thank you very much for taking time and patiently listening to this lecture. It's not an easy talking to a box. And I'm sure you may have questions, clarifications, and comments. These are all very welcome. Please email me if you want some clarifications or if you want to add something. My email is here. But also visit the Ateneo Martial Law Museum. It's an online museum. Some of these thoughts, some of these works are embedded in that museum. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much to the Department of History, to our chair, Dave Losada, for giving me the opportunity to be with you once again. Thank you very much.